Pope's visit to Cuba. Sorry. The committee will come to order. I will recognize myself and the ranking member, Mr. Berman, for 7 minutes each for our opening statements. We will then hear from our witness before we move to question and answers with members under the 5-minute rule. We're not giving members an opportunity to give a 1 minute? Sure we are. Without objection, the witness's prepared statement will be made a part of the record, and members may have 5 days to insert statements and questions for the record. The chair now recognizes herself for her greedy 7 minutes. Dr. Shah, welcome. We appreciate your being with us today. Our hearing this morning is to discuss the foreign assistance budget for fiscal year 2013. When we met last year, we discussed the foreign aid budget against the backdrop of our nation's challenging fiscal situation, including our vast annual deficit. Regrettably, as all of us know, little has changed in that front. 1 year later, newspaper headlines read, nearly 1 in 6 Americans in poverty, line grows long for free meals at U.S. schools, cost cutting leaves residents in dark. So our nation continues to face a substantial deficit, with 35 cents of every dollar being borrowed. The Congressional Budget Office predicted that our budget deficit will total a staggering $1.08 trillion this year. CBO has also projected that the jobless rate will rise to 8.9 by the end of 2012 and to 9.2 the following year. Therefore, it is critical that we continue to thoroughly scrutinize our government spending, and foreign assistance is no exception. Every dollar must be justified. It is a common argument that the foreign aid budget represents 1% of the overall federal budget. However, within that 1% are billions of U.S. taxpayer dollars that the American people have earned through hard work and have generously provided to nations around the world. It is our responsibility to ensure that these hard-earned dollars are held to the highest standard of transparency, are reaching the intended recipients, and are advancing our national and security interests and foreign policy priorities. Our foreign aid is not an entitlement program. Countries like Botswana, Chile, Thailand, and South Korea have all used U.S. foreign assistance to build their economies and eventually graduate from U.S. foreign assistance. This should be the goal for all countries that receive U.S. assistance. Dr. Shaw, in the previous remarks over the last year, you stated that by 2015, USAID could help several countries move away from U.S. assistance and thus close USAID missions. However, in the budget request that you've submitted does not include any scheduled USAID mission closures in fiscal year 2013. So, Dr. Shaw, what changes or reforms are you proposing or implementing to ensure that U.S. foreign aid does not create dependency, but rather leads to empowerment and sufficiency? What is USAID's strategy for moving countries beyond foreign assistance so that they can stand on their own? Modest progress was made in fiscal year 2012 to eliminate unnecessary programs and missions. However, in reviewing the fiscal year 2013 budget, it does not appear to reflect a commitment in increased cost savings and elimination of U.S. assistance to countries that no longer need our support. Further, the administration's congressional budget justification states that the budget proposal only requests what is absolutely necessary. Yet the administration is seeking nearly $2.6 billion under this request for international climate change programs, while humanitarian assistance accounts are scaled back. I remain concerned that funding of these programs is being provided at the expense of good governance, democracy, and rule of law programs. With limited resources, we must ask if this best meets our U.S. national security interest. For example, U.S. foreign assistance to the countries of the Western Hemisphere should reflect our main concerns, security and democracy in that area. Under this request, funding for environmental programs to Guatemala increases by $2.5 million, funding that could be put to better use elsewhere for prevention programs that counter narco-trafficking and promote security funding. At a time when violent drug cartels are expanding their influence and fundamental freedoms are under assault by the Alba tyrants, citizen security and democracy assistance must be USAID's priorities. This priority must be appropriately reflected in the President's Foreign Assistance Budget Report. The sharp cut in democracy funds for Cuba and Venezuela sends the wrong message to the international opposition in these countries. Cuban dissidents will question the United States' commitment to a free Cuba as funding is decreased by $5 million. And as the ALBA regimes move further down the path of totalitarianism, this proposed budget rewards the dictatorship of Bolivia, Ecuador, and Nicaragua with an increase of developmental assistance. In Nicaragua, the proposed budget reveals a $3.1 million boost in funding for fiscal year 2013. Yet the unconstitutional re-election of Daniel Ortega and his successful power grab demonstrates that USAID funds have not been spent wisely to promote democracy or transparent elections. Even more worrisome, our current USAID programs in Nicaragua support a handful of Sandinista mayors at the municipal level. In Ecuador, Correa continues to intimidate the private media and independent journalists, but the President's budget request increases funding for developmental assistance to Ecuador by $2 million. I also remain opposed to the increase in money for family planning and reproductive health, especially when all other global health accounts decline. The administration's reversal of the Mexico City policy allows U.S. government funding to be allocated to foreign non-governmental organizations that support or promote abortion as a method of family planning. An increase in family planning and reproductive health would only provide further opportunity for expanded funding for these organizations. So I look forward to discussing with you the reforms you have introduced to make the delivery of our foreign assistance more effective and what steps USAID is currently taking to break the welfare state relationship between U.S. foreign assistance and dependent countries. At this point, I would like to turn to my friend and colleague, Congressman Berman, the ranking member of our committee, for the opening statement that he would like to make. Mr. Berman is recognized.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chairman, and I join you in welcoming Dr. Shaw before the committee this morning. I appreciate this opportunity to consider the President's fiscal year 2013 budget request for humanitarian and development assistance and to review efforts to reform the way USAID does business. As you yourself have noted, Madam Chairman, the total cumulative fiscal year 13 international affairs request of $56.37 billion is $5.1 billion below last year's request and represents less of an increase over 2012 spending levels than the current annualized inflation rate. Moreover, I would add, international affairs spending, as you noted, represents only about 1% of our overall federal budget, and development and humanitarian spending is less than half of that amount. Despite these facts, there continues to be a widespread misunderstanding about the size of our foreign aid program. Polls show that most people think it is upwards of 20% of the budget, and that cutting foreign aid will somehow balance the budget. What's interesting is that the amount people think we should be spending on foreign aid is about 10 times more than we are actually spending. It bears repeating that we give humanitarian and development aid not only because it's the right thing to do, but because it is the smart thing to do. Addressing hunger, disease, and human misery abroad is a cost-effective way of making Americans safer here at home. And it is infinitely cheaper to address these problems with economic and technical assistance now than to wait until fragile states collapse or conflicts erupt in wide-scale violence and we have to resort to costly emergency aid or even military action. Reducing global poverty is not a partisan issue. Democrats and Republicans alike want to usher in an AIDS-free generation, expand access to clean water and sanitation, respond to natural disasters, help countries hold free and fair elections, and build new markets for U.S. exports. In fact, some of the biggest contributions to global health and development were spearheaded by Republican presidents, such as PEPFAR and the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which were both created by President George W. Bush. Still, in this difficult economic climate, we have a special obligation to ensure that the funds are spent as efficiently and as effectively as possible, and that they best serve our national interests. To do so, we must revise and update the framework of foreign aid laws and procedures that were designed for the last century and failed to reflect the many lessons we've learned over the past 50 years. For instance, we know that our programs have a much greater impact in countries that devote significant resources to improving the lives of their own people. Our dollars go much further if we and other donors work along with host countries in a coordinated way, instead of setting up parallel institutions that are duplicative or leave gaps. But our system of stovepipe accounts and earmarked funds makes it very difficult to respond to local needs and priorities. Another thing we've learned is that we need to be strategic about our investments. That means not only having a clear plan of what we are trying to achieve and specific indicators to measure success, but also being more selective and focused with our funding. Despite the need for improvements, I think we have some good stories to tell. Since its founding 50 years ago, USAID has played a critical role in lowering child deaths by 12 million a year. It has helped bring global coverage of basic childhood vaccines from 20% to 80% in most countries. The money we've invested in agricultural research led to the Green Revolution, which saved hundreds of millions from hunger and famine. And just recently, the World Bank announced that the first Millennium Development Goal, having the proportion of people living on less than $1 a day, has been reached ahead of schedule. But unfortunately, this message is not the one that dominates our headlines. After many years of providing aid, the public is skeptical that aid really helps. They are concerned that the problems are too big for us to be able to make a difference, and they don't have a clear idea of how the aid is actually used. In order to ensure that our money is being effectively spent and achieving the desired results, we need to collect solid empirical data about what works, and we need to make it available to the public. Without evidence that our programs are having a significant positive impact, we will lose the support and the confidence of the American people. Some seem to think we can keep cutting back on staff and salaries without hurting programs. Naturally, no one wants to waste money on unnecessary overhead costs, but it is time to realize that development is a discipline, and that our dedicated aid professionals, foreign and civil service alike, have important skills and experience that we want to retain and build upon. If we don't invest in our human resources, we'll pay dearly in the long run. One thing that can be done to put our aid programs on a sounder footing is to replace the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961 with legislation better geared to the needs of the 21st century. Last September, I realized a draft of the Global Partnerships Act, which lays out a vision for how to make foreign assistance serve our national interests more efficiently and more effectively. Dr. Shaw, I hope by now you've had a chance to review this draft. I would ask your staff begin sitting down with us to discuss how we can improve it. Madam Chairman, I make the same offer to you and your staff so that we can have the benefit of your views and suggestions before introducing it later this year. Before I close, I would just like to say a few words on behalf of our late colleague, Don Payne, who devoted so much of his career to serving the poor and downtrodden, particularly in Africa. And Dr. Shaw, I welcome your recent launch of the Donald Payne Fellowship Program, designed to attract outstanding young people to careers in international development. I know that Don had been working with you for the last year on your draft diversity and inclusion plan, and this will be an important element of it. But I also want to bring to your attention the last piece of legislation that Don introduced. H.R. 4141, the Food Assistance Improvement Act of 2012, is designed to improve the nutritional quality and cost effectiveness of United States food assistance, based on a number of recommendations made by the GAO. Don wanted to ensure that the food we provide is of the right type, quality, and nutritional value, not just to prevent starvation, but to maintain and restore health for the most vulnerable populations. I think one of the best ways we can honor Don's life and memory is to move this legislation through the process in a cooperative and bipartisan manner. Thank you, Dr. Shaw, and I look forward to your testimony.
Thank you so much, Mr. Berman. And now we will hear from our members who are recognized to give 1-minute remarks, starting with Congressman Smith, the chairman of the Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, and Human Rights.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and welcome, Dr. Shah, to the committee. Always great to see you. You know, I would ask that you, perhaps in your statement and certainly in your work, consider two issues that are largely overlooked. In 1998, I began the national effort to combat autism, wrote the law, which Combating Autism Act, and it was my bill that was just re-signed into law by President Obama, providing money for research. But on the international side, we had a hearing last May 31st, and it is estimated that there are 67 million individuals with autism, and in Africa, it's tens of millions. And we had a woman from Cote d'Ivoire who said, in Africa, there are no services, there are no diagnoses being made, and these children are being abandoned, and many of them die. Secondly, on the issue of hydrocephalic children, many of whom get that way because of infection. We had a hearing on that with Cure International on August 2nd. I have a bill that I'm going to be introducing, the International Infant Hydrocephalus Treatment and Training Act. There is a simple shuntless intervention, and I saw it when I was in Uganda and Kenya, that can save the lives of these children who otherwise die or are severely disabled. And I would ask you, we need to put resources behind both Cure International and their efforts and this effort on combating autism.
Thank you so much. Mr. Falama Vega.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to thank you for holding this hearing, and I want to extend my personal welcome to Dr. Shah this morning at our committee. And I want to associate myself with the comments made earlier by our ranking member, the gentleman from California, Mr. Berman, especially to recognize the tremendous contributions that our former colleague and a dear friend of mine, Congressman Payne, passed away. And I think it could not be more fitting that we named this program after him for the tremendous work that is done for the continent of Africa, just as much as we've worked together for the past 23 years in being helpful to these two regions in Africa as well as in the Asia-Pacific region. I do have some questions I will ask Dr. Shah as we proceed with the hearing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Rohrabacher is recognized.
Thank you very much, and we will miss Don Payne, and I will miss his aggressive refutations of the points that I make, as he always did so as a fine gentleman. We have $5 trillion more in debt right now than we had 3 years ago. $5 trillion, and unless that is dealt with, our economy will collapse, the currency will collapse. You're going to have to convince us, and I'm sorry, I love my colleagues who have such great hearts that they want to help autistic children in Africa and elsewhere, but you're going to have to convince me of why it's necessary to borrow more money from communist China in order to give money to some other country or some other group of people. I submit for the record, on top of that, Madam Chairman, at this point, I would submit for the record a list of perhaps $100 million worth of aid that we are giving to China. And I would like you to convince me of why it's necessary for us to provide this type of aid to the world's worst human rights abuser and a country that is governed by a clique that thinks of the United States as their enemy. Thank you very much, Madam
Thank
Chair.
you, Mr. Rohrabacher. Mr. Sears is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for holding this meeting, and I'd like to associate myself with some of the comments made here by my other members, especially when it comes to Don Payne. And also I'd like to associate myself with the $100 million that my good colleague Rohrabacher said that we are giving China. But I'm also more concerned about Western Hemisphere. It seems that some of the countries that need the most to promote democracy, we're cutting it, especially when you have countries like Iran moving into the region and establishing a relationship with some of these countries that are really out to end democracy in this area. So I'm very concerned of the cuts, especially when it comes to Cuba. There's a crackdown going on now just before the Pope visits, and I don't understand why this administration is so intent on cutting just about anything that promotes democracy in this area, when we should really be putting more money into it. This business of appeasing some of these countries is just, I don't understand it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sears. Judge Poe of Texas is recognized.
Minister Shaw, it's like we talked about in December, we can't reform foreign assistance without Congress and the administration working together to do so. For example, your new evaluation policy, in my opinion, is a step in the right direction. I commend you for that. On the congressional side, we're trying to do some things here, too. I appreciate your support for my foreign assistance reform bill, H.R. 3159, that is co-sponsored by the ranking member, Mr. Berman. We need the administration to establish guidelines for monitoring and evaluation of America's money. We need those guidelines implemented by all departments that deal in foreign assistance so we can hold them accountable, learn from mistakes, and make sure those programs are either funded or not funded. Right now, it's hard to tell the bad programs from the good ones because we don't evaluate them. We should shut down programs that don't reform and start doing what they promised when they got our money. Instead, we should give that money to programs that deliver. After 50 years of doing foreign assistance, we don't subject our aid to rigorous evaluation. Those days need to end immediately and hold people accountable. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Connolly of Virginia.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, but I think Mr. Deutsch may have been ahead of me.
Yes, you are so right, Mr. Deutsch. See, I'm just trying to be friends with you in hopes I can get some more of that chocolate. Mr. Deutsch.
It's not its way, Madam Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Deutsch is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to my friend and gentleman, Mr. Connolly. Thank you, Dr. Shaw, for being with us today. Dr. Shaw, I'd like to commend you on the progress that you've made with the USAID Forward program to streamline the agency and make USAID more effective in this difficult budget climate. I've said many times before this committee that the work that's being done across the globe through our funding of international assistance programs is absolutely critical to the security of our own country. Programs like the Global Health Initiative, which works to prevent the spread of HIV/AIDS, and fund President Bush's PEPFAR program, are vital to preventing global pandemics. These are the kinds of programs that work to stabilize the most vulnerable regions in the world. International assistance should be an area where we can come together to support programs that save the lives of women and children by providing access to reproductive health care so that children don't have to lose their mothers during childbirth, so that young women delivering their first child, women whose growth is stunted because of poor nutrition or childhood illness, women living in rural areas or those who use traditional maternity care and deliver at home don't end up ostracized from their community from the debilitating effects of preventable conditions like obstetric fistula. Dr. Shah, we provide funding for international assistance programs because they reflect our core American values. I look forward to your testimony today, and I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much. Mr. Royce is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. According to a recent study, when asked how to solve the North Korea's chronic food shortage problem, 94% of North Korean refugees said the government needed to be reformed. Only 1.4% said the answer was more food aid. They know that sending more food will only help the regime's inner circle and keep it well-fed. We had one senior North Korean defector say, "We must not give food aid to North Korea. Doing so is the same as providing funding for North Korea's nuclear program." And he argued that it allows Kim Jong-un to divert resources towards its military program. It allows the military to be well-fed. According to one South Korean parliamentarian, the North is hoarding 1 million tons of rice, playing up the shortfall to pressure us and others for aid. Many others suspect that the North is hoarding food for the 100th anniversary of North Korea's founder, Kim Il-sung. Food aid, of course, would subsidize that event. Consolidating the Kim dynasty is no contribution to human rights. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Ms. Bass is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. Shaw, thank you for your steadfast leadership and commitment to foreign affairs and development. I commend the women and men of USAID, some of whom work in extreme and high-stress environments. You and your colleagues continue to share the goodwill of the American people without our fail. For this, we are very grateful. I look forward to learning where you see real opportunity to maximize U.S. development and diplomatic efforts. I imagine the last several years have not been easy, and you should be commended for your resilient work to make a more efficient and effective USAID, both abroad and here at home within the agency itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Mr. Connolly is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and I welcome Dr. Shaw to the committee again. A great power must reject the false choice that we can deal with our debt or we can deal with other obligations, but we cannot do both. A great power has obligations, and it has interests that must be propounded, and a modest bilateral and multilateral aid program is a tool without which we commit unilateral disarmament. If we're worried about the competition coming from China, they are getting off airplanes and on airplanes in every developing country in the world. And we are retreating. And that is not a wise long-term policy for the United States of America. I'm interested particularly in hearing about two things today. One is efficacy. What do we know about what works in our aid program over 40, 50 years of experience now? And secondly, how are we best structured to make sure we're deploying the assets and resources we've got from an administrative point of view? Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Wilson is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Director Shaw, for your presentation of the President's fiscal year 2013 budget request for USAID to the committee today. It is a pleasure, a pleasing pleasure to have you. America has long been seen as an example for the rest of the world in democracy and diplomacy, and thank you for your role in leading this charge. The assistance of developing nations is integral in our national security. In fact, you had not spent many days on the job before the devastating earthquake ripped through Port-au-Prince, Haiti, a day that I'm sure you recall vividly. In fact, the world recalls that day. That was a day that forever changed the direction of Haiti and will not soon be forgotten by many of my constituents in Miami-Dade County, Florida. Many of them note and are grateful for the responsiveness of USAID, both immediate and ongoing. I'm encouraged by the outreach that you and your staff have maintained with the South Florida community. When I traveled to Haiti, I was alarmed by the thousands that remain homeless without any hope of finding work or housing. I was disturbed by the living nightmare of women and girls who are suffering from sexual and physical abuse. Upon my return, it was the stories of rape by force and the visuals of pregnant teens that haunted me. I sponsored a resolution on gender-based violence in Haiti to reassure the people of Haiti, particularly the women and children, that the United States remains a committed partner in the fight to end all forms of gender-based violence in Haiti. I would like to encourage the administration through the State Department and USAID to encourage the Haitian government to take proactive steps that are consistent with the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights recommendations on sexual violence to eliminate gender-based violence. It is
Thank you.
Oh, that's it?
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you, Ms. Wilson. Thank you to all of our members for their opening statements. And now the chair is pleased to welcome our witness, that Dr. Shaw serves as the administrator of the United States Agency for International Development. He was nominated by President Obama and sworn in as the 16th USAID administrator in December 2009. Previously, Dr. Shaw served as Undersecretary for Research, Education, and Economics, and as Chief Scientist at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. He also served as Director of Agricultural Development in the Global Development Program at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Dr. Shaw earned his medical degree from the University of Pennsylvania Medical School and a master's degree in health economics from the Wharton School of Business. Dr. Shaw, thank you for attending. Your entire statement will be made a part of the record, and I realize that your timer is not working. I'll just fling the gavel at you when the 5 minutes is up in a very subtle way. Dr. Shaw, you are recognized.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Ros-Lehtinen, Ranking Member Berman, and members of the committee. It's an honor to be here today to present to you and discuss the President's fiscal year 2013 budget request for USAID. I'd like to take a moment as well to recognize the life and work of your fellow committee member, Don Payne. Congressman Payne was, of course, well known on these issues and deeply respected and loved at our agency. He spent considerable amount of time with me and with our staff and traveling to visit our programs, and we will continue to do what we can to honor and carry forward his legacy. Chairman Ros-Lehtinen, Ranking Member Berman, each of you has challenged our agency to be more businesslike in the way we carry out our mission and to apply a laser-like focus on the results we seek to achieve and to pursue them aggressively. Madam Chairman, I have appreciated your continued emphasis on the need for USAID to aggressively engage the private sector, to seek more leverage and more results in how we spend our resources. And in response to that, we have expanded a number of efforts to do just that. Ranking Member Berman, I appreciate your efforts to pursue a reform agenda for foreign assistance that prioritizes monitoring and evaluation, focusing on results and transparency. And we believe we've taken a number of important steps to take that to the next level of performance. 2 years ago, President Obama and Secretary Clinton called for elevating development as a key part of America's national security and foreign policy, recognizing that in frontline states such as Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iraq, in transition countries in the Middle East and North Africa, in expanding our engagements with the private sector to create markets of the future and jobs at home, and in focusing on and achieving real development results in moving people out of hunger and poverty, saving children's lives, improving access to water and education, and responding to humanitarian crises effectively, and promoting democracy, rights, and governance. In doing these tasks, our work makes us safer and more secure over time. The President's FY13 budget request is designed to do this. We have prioritized across our portfolio, continuing the path of closing missions in places like Montenegro, Panama, and Guyana. We're cutting programs. More than 165 programs have been reduced or cut, so that today our China request, for example, is exclusively for only those communities in Tibet and for some very small disease control efforts to prevent the spread of international communicable diseases. We've eliminated health programs in Peru and Mexico, eliminated food and agriculture programs in Kosovo, Serbia, and Ukraine, all to refocus our efforts and our priorities in those places where we can generate the most significant results. The American Evaluation Association has referred to our approach to monitoring and evaluation as a gold standard across the federal government and encouraged other agencies to adopt the approach we are trying to adopt everywhere we work. And perhaps most importantly, we are seeking to implement a new model of partnership with faith-based institutions, private sector entities, universities around this country and the world, and most importantly, to get much more value for money in the way we work with our existing NGO and contract partners. We do this work with great care, trying to invest more directly in local institutions to stretch the value of American dollars and get better development results. Our budget request includes a request to authorize a working capital fund for USAID to help ensure that we have the contracts capacity and oversight and management capability to continue to squeeze more value for money in how we seek to achieve development results. And this budget focuses on our core priorities. To support the transitions in the Arab Spring, we're requesting a joint state aid account of $770 million in an incentive fund designed to support a critical transition. In our frontline states of Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, we continue to fight for sustainable programs that are delivering results. We have reduced the scale and scope of those programming to ensure sustainability, and we are very cognizant of the security risks and security management strategies we've put in place in those environments. Global health at $7.9 billion is the single largest item in the foreign assistance account. This amount of resource will allow us to meet the President's goal of increasing treatment for HIV/AIDS patients from 4 million to 6 million people, essentially saving 2 million additional lives. It will allow us to maintain our commitment to fight for and implement the end of AIDS by creating a generation born without HIV/AIDS. It will allow us to continue to prioritize the very efficient President's Malaria Initiative, which has seen in many of its priority countries child death come down by more than 30% due to effective and cost-effective programs implemented well. And it allows us to capture some of the new opportunities that technology and innovation have made possible in terms of saving children's lives. The budget includes a $1 billion request for our Feed the Future partnership. We saw last year the worst drought in more than 6 decades hit the Horn of Africa, placing 13.3 million people at risk of hunger and starvation. USAID led an international humanitarian response, helping to save thousands of children's lives and feed more than 4.5 million individuals. But food aid costs 8 to 10 times more than investing in helping people produce and sustain their own futures through agriculture. And we're starting to see real results in our Feed the Future partnership, with countries in that program experiencing a rate of agricultural productivity growth nearly 8 times the global average. So I will conclude my statement with a thank you to our staff. We've asked them to take on real risks in difficult environments and to take on a significant and aggressive reform agenda, which I call USAID Forward. They have done this in an impressive manner, and while much work lies ahead, I appreciate your support and your ideas and your consultation as we continue to work together to improve our national security.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shaw. Thank you for excellent testimony. And now we will begin our question and answer period, 5 minutes per member. I will ask a series of questions, Dr. Shaw. You won't have time to answer, but I respectfully request if I could get a written response to these, that would be wonderful. On Haiti, the President's fiscal year 2013 budget allocates nearly $350 million in new assistance funds for Haiti. The recent resignation of the Haitian Prime Minister and the absence of the interim Haiti Recovery Commission raises serious concerns about what oversight mechanisms are being employed to guarantee accountability of U.S. taxpayer dollars. So if you could respond in written form, what action is the U.S. government undertaking in order to ensure proper transparency of assistance funds to Haiti? On funding for the Palestinian Authority, Dr. Shaw, the administration is pressing Congress to release $147 million for Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. Among the arguments utilized is that Abu Mazen needs to be supported because he's all we have. However, the administration is not demanding that Abu Mazen return to the negotiation table with Israel without preconditions, nor that he stops his unilateral statehood scheme at the UN. The administration also says we need to help rebuild the Palestinian economy, this at a time when our economy is facing serious challenges and Americans are suffering. Now, in the list of projects the administration wants to fund with $147 million in taxpayer dollars, there are some that are aimed at addressing humanitarian concerns, funding for water programs, health, food aid, and support for USAID programming. Congress and the administration can't find common ground on these. However, there are others that Congress finds difficult to justify as advancing U.S. national security interests or in assisting our ally and friend Israel. In this respect, if you could justify $2.9 million for trade facilitation, $4.5 million for tourism promotion, and $8.1 million for road construction. Specifically, I would ask that you justify a total of $26.4 million in reconstruction and recovery for Hamas-run Gaza that includes cash for work programs. And more broadly, how much has the U.S. spent in total since 1993 in West Bank and Gaza, and how much is the administration proposing we spend next year, and how can we justify that? Turning to Egypt, if you could respond to what mechanisms you have developed to ensure that U.S. assistance to Egypt does not directly or indirectly provide support or otherwise is influenced by the Ministry for International Cooperation and Development. And what is the justification for the provision of any U.S. assistance to an Egyptian government potentially dominated by the Muslim Brotherhood or affiliated extremists, do you agree that no U.S. assistance should be provided directly or indirectly to the Muslim Brotherhood and affiliated extremists? And lastly, to my native homeland of Cuba, and Mr. Sears well spoke of that. The Obama administration has had a policy of concession toward the Castro brothers, but it has not yielded any measurable change for democracy, and I'm deeply concerned about the Department of State and USAID's growing funding for programs that promote the Castro brothers' sham economic reforms at the expense of funding for important programs that do support Cuba's political prisoners and the growing internal opposition. Though this administration likes to point to Castro's so-called economic reforms as a sign of change, the fact remains that 11 million Cubans continue to suffer under brutal conditions with the repressive Castro regime, and this new focus on economic reforms will do nothing more than validate the Castro regime and promote their radical anti-American propaganda. And so my question is, how does harnessing U.S. foreign assistance to promote the Castro brothers' sham economic reforms build the capacity for the internal opposition, and how can we prioritize the funding for Cuba to strive for a free and democratic Cuba by, again, funding the pro-democracy programs there on the island? So I thank you, Dr. Shaw, for that written response whenever you get to it. Thank you so much, sir. And now I'd like to turn to Mr. Berman.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chairman. Dr. Shaw, I think under your leadership, a number of important and exciting things are happening at USAID. You've been leading the way to make our aid more efficient, more effective, more accountable. You have restarted the process of doing country strategies so that we're clear about our objectives and our measures of success. You have established a new system of monitoring and evaluation, as the gentleman from Texas mentioned earlier, to ensure that funds are spent properly and achieve the desired results. And you have launched procurement reforms to make it easier to partner with small businesses and local NGOs, rather than bundling everything into huge contracts that only the biggest companies could hope to compete for. But when it comes to Afghanistan, particularly, Pakistan perhaps as well, our largest recipients of ESF, these considerations seem to go out the window. We don't seem to have a clear idea of what success would look like in Afghanistan. Each week, there seems to be some new report about corruption and misuse of funds, with little good news attached. We're spending a huge portion of our funding on security costs instead of on actual programs. And USAID has just recommended limiting the use of cooperative agreements and grants in Afghanistan, which means, in effect, ending our work with NGOs and handing it all over to large companies. Can you talk to us about what you would regard as success in Afghanistan, how you're guarding against corruption, what progress we've made so far, and why we're relying on so heavily on big contractors? And let me just insert one other question, if you have a chance to answer that as well. This deals with Syria. Basically, world leaders have made a historic commitment to protect populations from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. What can you tell us in open session about what the United States is doing to uphold its responsibility to protect civilians in Syria? Do we have any assessment of the needs, and are we working with international humanitarian agencies to find ways of meeting them? So Afghanistan, more generally, and Syria, that specific question. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. I appreciate your comments about our overall reforms, and I would suggest that they have also been implemented in Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, we have seen over the last several years significant and important results. 7 million kids in school, 64% health coverage, leading to what a report that came out in December that showed the largest reductions in maternal and neonatal mortality anywhere in the world have taken place in Afghanistan. We've also seen real economic performance, 10 to 11% annualized growth rates for a number of years, and a more than tripling of domestic revenue collection, which needs to continue on that trend for the Afghans to increasingly take up the responsibility of paying for their own public expenditures. The challenge going forward, and the challenge the President has articulated, is sustaining those gains in a challenging environment, and in an environment where we seek enough stability for our troops to be able to come home on the schedules the President has announced and supported. In that context, we're doing a number of things differently. We've implemented a sustainability guidance, reviewed all our programs, found that some needed to be restructured pretty dramatically in order to be able to be sustained by Afghan revenues and by any legitimate future of what assistance could look like for the Afghan people. Second, we're working closely with international partners to have a long-term strategy that is consistent with the Afghan priorities, but also forces real prioritization and focuses on specific and concrete results, things like tripling energy access to businesses and to people in Afghanistan, which has been achieved over the last 6 years. We believe that we want to be working more with local institutions, including in a way that monitors against corruption, government and NGOs. I will look into the specific point about the cooperative agreements, because that was only intended to apply to large-scale infrastructure being developed in complex security environments, but I'll have to look into that and come back to you more specifically. On Syria in particular, we have certainly been very active in conducting and partnering with others to conduct assessments. Syria actually has a strong international community present inside of Syria, in part due to their support for Iraqi refugees over a longer period of time. Many of them have conducted assessments and presented us with opportunities to support specific humanitarian efforts with a real focus on getting commodities and medical support and trained medical personnel to immediately affected areas. That said, any international humanitarian effort is fundamentally constrained by the serious and very transparent lack of access created by the Syrian government's active military campaign. And while I can't speak about this in much more detail, I think it's safe to say that we should have modest expectations of what humanitarian partners will be able to achieve there, but we are working with them aggressively as we can.
Thank you very much, Mr. Berman, and thank you, Dr. Shaw. Mr. Smith is recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Dr. Shaw, when the President's emergency plan for AIDS relief, or PEPFAR, was marked up here in this room a decade ago, I sponsored both the Conscience Clause Amendment and the Anti-Trafficking Prostitution Amendment. Both were enacted into law in 2003 and reauthorized again in 2008. I've read the Acquisition and Assistance Policy Directive, the AAPD 1204, issued on February 15th of 2012, which replaces previous guidance on these matters. The policy directive reiterates the law verbatim. An organization, including a faith-based organization, shall not be required as a condition of receiving assistance, then it goes on to list it, and that the organization has a religious or moral objection, it shall not be discriminated against in the solicitation or issuance of grants, and it goes on from there. Can you provide assurance, including a commitment to robust monitoring, that grants, contracts, or cooperative agreements haven't been, aren't now, nor will be written in such a way, and I'm thinking of integrated services, to diminish or to even preclude organizations, including faith-based organizations, from applying or receiving those funds? Secondly, on the anti-sex trafficking prostitution law, the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, as you know, held that USAID may enforce the requirement that entities have a policy opposing sex trafficking and prostitution, while the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York has ruled against it. Your view on this proviso, and will the administration appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court? I understand the filing deadline for cert is May 2nd, so that date is fast arriving. And finally, number 3, according to the GAO report issued on October 11th, a USAID-funded award recipient, the International Development Law Organization, or IDLO, advised the Kenyan entity responsible for drafting the new Kenyan Constitution to include language in the Constitution that would legalize abortion in that country. The only reason we learned about this blatant violation of U.S. law prohibiting the use of funds to lobby for or against abortion is that IDLO itself informed GAO in response to GAO's inquiry. The USAID's official responsible for managing the grant informed GAO that she did not fully read IDLO's reports until the USAID IG inquiry brought them to her attention in mid-2010. I would note my extreme disappointment that the USAID IG did not reveal this violation in its report to Congress on September 29, 2010. My question, please explain how this violation occurred, why USAID did not properly monitor the grant so that the violation could be immediately rectified, and what, if any, measures have been taken to ensure that future grants that potentially involve lobbying for abortion adhere to legal funding restrictions. Dr. Shah.
Thank you, Congressman, and thank you for your partnership and work, especially on fighting for the health of vulnerable populations around the world. We very much appreciate that. I want to, on your first point, faith-based institutions and partnerships are absolutely critical to our ability to be successful around the world. And one of the first things I did was ask our faith-based office to do a systematic review of both how we work with faith-based partners and to look in depth at our procurement and contracting to explore whether we could do a better job of being more accessible and a better partner overall and as an agency. We've been steadily implementing many of the findings that they have come up with, and I think we are doing a better job, and by any number of metrics, in terms of our engagements with the faith-based community and in terms of supporting the fact that they sometimes generate better results because they have a deeper, longer-standing, more sustainability-oriented commitment to delivering services for very vulnerable populations. So the short answer, sir, to your first question is yes, absolutely. We will be implementing the law as you read it, and we will have a strict focus on making sure that is the case.
And I hope, again, that integrated services would not become code for exclusion.
Integrated was one of the issues that came up in the review. And we have come up with a few options that have enabled us to work to ensure that that's not exclusionary for faith-based partners. And we're now exploring a second-tier set of options that will go even farther than that. So we recognize that issue and have been working on that. And I think getting positive feedback from our faith-based colleagues and partners on our steps in that space. In terms of your point about the case that's with the Solicitor General, I understand it is the Solicitor General's decision and will be made soon. I can follow up with your office in more detail, but I thank you for raising that.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shaw. Thank you, Mr. Smith. Mr. Falama-Vega.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. Shaw, approximately 20 years ago, the downfall of the Soviet Union, one of the decisions our government made was to show no more presence of USAID in the Pacific region because of limited resources. We had new countries coming out of East Asia, South Asia, Central Asia. And for the last 100 years, USAID is not around. And now I've got a little problem here because currently, People's Republic of China currently has a $600 million development aid program for these 16 island nations. And when I looked around, the last thing we did was we sent a medical ship full of doctors and nurses and did inoculations, vaccinations about 2 years ago. And my question is, we have to wait another 40 years to send another ship? And I'm very concerned with the fact that there is no presence. And I think it's been 2 years now USAID has been looking at whether or not it should justify itself in coming to the Pacific region. Where are we with this right now? Is there still lack of importance in this region, why USAID feels it shouldn't be there? I notice also with interest, and please don't get me wrong, absolutely these countries need it. Funding, the Western Hemisphere, 3 countries, South Asia, 4 countries, Middle East, 5 countries, Asia Pacific region, 3 countries, Africa, 19 countries. And I'm sure there will probably be assistance. There's not one thing mentioned about Central Asia, nothing mentioned about Eastern Europe, and absolutely zero for the Pacific region. Can you comment on that?
Yes, sir. Thank you for the comment and your point. The Pacific region is in fact a priority for this administration. President Obama articulated as such on his trip to the Pacific, and his comment on returning was that this is a region where they welcome and seek active and greater partnership.
The problem I have with this, Dr. Shah, is that in my humble opinion, the only foreign policy we have towards the Pacific region is really with Australia and New Zealand. These island countries are only incidental to our overall major interests in this region. And that's, and I'm very concerned about this. If it's possible that China can provide a $600 million economic development program for these countries, why is it that it tells me that we're really not that interested?
So I would just argue, sir, that we have in fact opened a new satellite office in Papua New Guinea. We are putting in place regional programs for the Pacific Islands. We're doing so, as you mentioned, in partnership with New Zealand and with Australia, and focused on using new tools and technology so we get as much leverage as is possible, since this is overall a very challenging fiscal environment. And we're doing that with an eye towards some core priorities for the region: health, education, regional integration in terms of economics, and resilience. We know that 2/3 of the predicted disasters over the course of the next decade will be Asia-Pacific in where they take place. And so we have active disaster risk reduction programs that are seen as the best in the world.
I know my time is up, Dr. Shah, and I've got to hit you with one more question.
Sure.
One of the issues that is always dear to my heart is the fact that, you know, the usual Chinese saying, feed the man fish, he can only live for 3 days, but if you teach him how to fish, he'll live forever. I honestly believe that one of the most important public diplomacy issues that our country should really promote and enhance. Currently, we have about 670,000 foreign students attending our American colleges and universities. And I'm curious to know, where is USAID putting its priority in providing educational opportunities for foreign students? Central Asia, countries that are really, really in need of a nucleus of educated and professional people, so they can continue to do better in terms of how they can provide greater transparency to their given governments. And I was just wondering, is USAID serious in providing educational opportunities for students from these countries that really have a need?
So we absolutely are. I would suggest we prioritize, at this point, basic education and track outcomes so that people can progress to secondary school. In secondary education, we prioritize getting girls to complete and work through secondary education. And we've just launched a new series of expanded partnerships to allow for twinning between U.S. Higher education institutions and counterparts around the world. Today, we know that it can often be cheaper and more effective to help people gain higher education through any number of innovative ways, including virtual learning and other tools. So we're very cost-conscious and technology-informed in how we're pursuing that goal, but we are pursuing that goal.
I had 100 more questions, Madam Chair, but I'm going to give
Thank
up.
you
Thank
so
you, Madam
much.
Chair. Thank you, Dr. Shah.
Thank you, and bless you over there. Mr. Rohrbacher.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. And Mr. Administrator, I put in the record in my opening statement a list of...
Without objection.
We already have that in the record, Madam Chairman. Thank you. But in that list, you will see the list of items that are going to China, and there are millions, perhaps 100 million that I've listed. Many of them are indeed for environmental assistance to China to try to improve their environment. But here are some of the others on the list. Here's $150,000 for the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development for development assistance to China. Here's $47,000 to Management Systems International for development assistance. USAID to Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors of $2.4 million for sustainable livelihoods in China. The Asia Foundation, $1 million to improve disaster management in China. There is, for example, to an undisclosed foreign contractor, $150,000 for development assistance in China, and $450,000 to the Asia Foundation for Disaster Management in China, almost $300,000 to Bob Davis Non-Governmental Organization for Sustainable Livelihoods in China. Now, these things all add up to a considerable sum of money. Now, can you tell me why, when China, at this moment, is expanding their military spending in a way that is threatening to its neighbors and to the security of the United States, at a time when it's developing its space-based weapon systems and rocket systems, at a time when it's giving aid to rogue states that hate the United States, whether it's Iran or North Korea or Venezuela, why are we providing money to them? Actually, why are we borrowing money from them in order to give it back to them so that we can pay interest on the money that we just gave to them? Something's screwy here. You may proceed to try to answer that.
Okay. Sir, the fiscal year 2013 request for China is $6.5 million. Almost all of that is exclusively for programs to assist Tibetan communities to preserve their unique livelihoods, and with a small amount to focus on limiting the transmission of infectious disease, which is a CDC partnership with China that grew out of the SARS epidemic and today focuses on top-level HIV/AIDS.
So you said that's $6 million going to who?
$6.5 million going to programs to support Tibetan communities.
Okay, $6 million going to Tibetan communities.
I believe the $6.5 million covers the Tibetan communities and the CDC, Centers for Disease Control partnership with their counterpart.
Okay, so we're helping them control their health care needs for their people.
That's a program that grew out of the SARS epidemic, which of course had global consequences, and it's a technical program that helps them maintain focus. There are two other important points.
By the way, there are always global implications to every outbreak of every communicable disease.
There are two other important points. First is on global health. China has traditionally been a recipient of funding from the global funds for aid, TB, and malaria. This administration has taken the position and used our board seat on that group to try to transition China to be a donor to that group as opposed to a recipient. And that would be, if made, a shift of several $100 million.
Let me ask you this. Have they donated more than they've taken out?
I don't know the answer.
I know the answer to that. I've confronted the people before with this, and they're taking out like 10 times more than they're putting in, and you call that a success?
No, we're actually trying to change that. We're trying
I know
to
you're
make
trying
it so
to
they
change
don't
it, but that is not a
funds.
success. You have not been successful at changing that. What you've been successful at is now China gives some money while it's taking out an enormous amount of other money. But what about all these other things that I just push in your direction? Development assistance, disaster management? Why are we paying China? Why are we borrowing money from China to give it back to them like that when they're spending their money on weapons aimed at the United States?
So I'd be happy to have my team look at the list and come back to you specifically. I know with certainty that the request for FY13 exclusively focuses on support for Tibetan communities and a small amount of technical partnership to manage international disease control priorities.
Madam
the other
Chairman,
point I'd
before
make,
my
sir,
time has run out, let me just note, I am opposed to free trade with dictatorships, and especially the world's worst human rights abuser. But what I'm more opposed to is giving aid to human rights abusers and dictatorships. And we have got the worst of all worlds in our relationship with China, which is the world's worst human rights abuser. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Rohrabacher. Mr. Deutsch is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. Shah, the President's budget requests $569 million for family planning and reproductive health activities, including $39 million for the UN Population Fund from international organizations and programs account, and $530 million in bilateral family planning funds from global health programs account. Can you explain, please, the types of programs that USAID funds to provide access to reproductive health services that has the potential to prevent 350,000 women from dying during pregnancy or childbirth each year, or prevent the horrific effects from unsafe childbirth like obstetric fistula?
Thank you, Congressman. The family planning program focuses on, as you're aware, voluntary family planning partnerships with countries. The theme, we do not in any context support or encourage or in any way fund abortion. In fact, the opposite is the case. By having better birth spacing and by avoiding unintended consequences, especially for very young girls, ages 12 to 16, we see much reduced levels of abortions in the countries where we work. The other theme in this program has been transition to local management and control and funding responsibility for these efforts. Particularly in Latin America, we've seen over the last 12 to 15 years, many of these programs transition to their own domestic management and their own domestic revenue support. And the reason countries choose to do that is they see that as the number of births go down and the total fertility rate in countries go down, that lays the basis for economic growth, greater stability, greater ability to invest in children and their access to school and education, and has been a core part of generating what we call in this field a demographic dividend, which kickstarts development activities.
Thanks, Dr. Shaw. Dr. Shaw, changing gears, I just would ask if you could provide some information to us, perhaps in writing after the hearing. It's been reported that USAID provides assistance, possibly $2 million, to the Palestine Investment Fund, particularly to its loan guarantee program for technical support, is my understanding. If you could provide us with information on that funding, whether or not those reports are accurate, and the nature of scope of any such contributions, that would be helpful.
We can do that.
All right, I appreciate it. And then finally, like the chairman and my friend Congresswoman Wilson and other colleagues on this committee, many of our constituents were deeply affected by the devastating earthquake in Haiti that occurred now more than 2 years ago. And one common refrain that I hear from my constituents is why the recovery process seems to be moving so slowly, and of course the widespread allegations of corruption. The question I have more specifically is, what is USAID doing to work with the Haitian government to address the longstanding rampant corruption charges and provide support for civil society to establish proper government institutions, judicial processes, and uphold the rule of law?
Thank you. I think it's important on Haiti to mention that there has been very significant and critical progress. We've seen food production go up significantly. Corn yields are up 300+%, rice yields 60 to 70%, more better nutrition outcomes. We've seen the effective control of the cholera epidemic, which of course we need to stay vigilant about. The access to clean water and safe sanitation has gone up compared to pre-earthquake levels. And most importantly, we're seeing real private investment in industrial park in the north that's creating 60,000 jobs, and a new Marriott hotel in Port-au-Prince that will do something similar. So there are signs of real progress that I think we all look to with real hope. There are also challenges. One of the challenges has been that it has taken some time for a peaceful transition in terms of democratic governance to lead to a fully effective government. And as was noted earlier, the Prime Minister, who we were working very closely with on the assistance program and coordination, just recently left his role after being placed in it quite late, and so we await progress there. We are in a constant and very deep multi-level discussion with our Haitian partners. We support civil society and in fact have made a number of procurement changes to how we work to support small businesses here to be part of the effort, but also to support Haitian civil society, NGOs, and local businesses more directly. And in fact, as we do larger procurements for different types of projects, we've built in very strict standards to ensure that there is an effective role for those types of organizations. On judicial reform, we've continued to partner with our Haitian counterparts. As you know, President Martelly is committed to an effective judicial reform, and we could go into that in some detail, but that has been an important part of the dialogue, because you're absolutely right that lays the basis for rule of law that allows all of those earlier gains in private investment and other things to really take hold and expand.
And Madam Chairman, if I could just ask Dr. Shaw to provide the committee with some of the details on those changes in the procurement process, on the specific efforts with civil society, and most specifically in our community, to make sure that our constituents understand the opportunities they have as well.
He'll do that. Thank you. Judge Poe is recognized.
Dr. Shaw, two issues I want to talk about. One that we have discussed before, that's American rice. As you know, historically, American Rice, their best trading partners, Iran, Iraq, and Cuba. Those markets have sort of dried up over the years, and American rice farmers are looking for markets. I would just encourage you that when you have the opportunity in USAID to be involved in shipments of rice to somebody, that American Rice goes there. I'd like to have unanimous consent to put in the record a letter, bipartisan letter, Madam Chair, to the Minister of Trade of
Without
Iraq.
objection.
And I'll furnish you a copy of that, too. On the issue of USAID helping out other countries, there are 12 departments, 25 agencies, 60 federal offices that run foreign aid programs for the United States. If you have any sort of evaluation policy, let alone a standardized evaluation policy, MCC is the only one with a strong policy. USAID's was weak and just issued last year. State Department was released in mid-February of this year and was even weaker, and the DOD doesn't have anything in writing about evaluation of programs. Do you believe a common set of guidelines on measurable goals and monitoring of evaluation plans would be helpful?
Absolutely, sir. It's, in fact, part of the President's policy directive on development was calling for such an approach. I would note when I took office and looked at our own performance here, I thought we could do a lot better. I criticized our current approach at that time and said that it was a 2-2-2 approach with 2 consultants traveling for 2 weeks and writing reports that 2 people read and didn't really have the statistical validation that I think you need in this field to demonstrate whether or not your programs are working. We put in place a new evaluation policy to ensure every project we pursue has an independent third-party evaluation done by very rigorous standards that include measuring data, collecting the right data, looking at a counterfactual, having a baseline. And the result of that will be before the end of this year, we will post more than 250 accredited independent validations with no success story glossiness to them at all, straight to our website and put them in the public domain so that we and everybody else can learn about the results of our programs. I will just say that because we've been able to improve our evaluation, we know that, for example, the President's Malaria Initiative has been reducing all-cause child mortality, under 5 mortality, by 25 to 30% in country after country in a very efficient way. We know that our Feed the Future programs are starting to really show results, with agricultural productivity growth being anywhere from 7 to 8 times that of the global average. And we even are studying our more challenging to study democracy, governance, and rights programs to try to understand which strategies, for instance, are most effective at helping kids escape situations of trafficking and modern-day slavery. And I believe this work and this area of endeavor ought to be treated like a science, and the evaluation policy is intended to help move us in that direction.
Will you continue to work with us on H.R. 3159, co-sponsored by the ranking member and myself, to try to have an overall evaluation policy of foreign aid? As alluded to by many members, Americans are frustrated about foreign aid for a lot of reasons, but one of the frustrations, they're writing checks and they don't know where that money ends up in whose hands throughout the country. And I would suggest that a good place to start is with the $1.6 billion that we give to Egypt, especially during these times, that is co-sponsored by you and the State Department. Second question, I'm glad to see that USAID is cutting funding in some programs and putting more money for monitoring and evaluation. Explain why you're doing this.
Well, you know, Representative, I certainly want to also thank you for your leadership on monitoring and evaluation. I think it's critical that we invest in collecting data so that we know what we're achieving. And we're trying to do that in every one of our efforts. In fact, we have had more than 60% of our foreign services now with the agency within the last 5 years, and most of that is just attrition, rehiring, and our demographics. It's given us an opportunity to ask everyone to go through sort of rigorous training on evaluation. We've set up an evaluation and monitoring service center. In difficult environments like Afghanistan, we've tripled our staff presence and gotten out more so that we can actually visit, see programs, and ensure there's more accountability. And that allows us to report on results with much more credibility. So I appreciate the focus on that. I think it is worth investing in that activity, because if you don't know the results you're generating, you end up spending much, much, much more money before you kill programs or close things that don't work, and you end up under-investing in those things that have the potential to achieve dramatic results, like what we're seeing in reducing child death, for example.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Connolly is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Dr. Shaw, if I could sort of pick up on one of those last points of my friend and colleague, Ted Poe. I'll use the word efficacy. It's not like foreign assistance is a new concept. We've been doing it for a long time. Why don't we have a more robust explanation and advocacy for what we've been doing for half a century? I mean, by this point, surely we have some metrics we can point to where we have done this, 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 and this, and we've learned from this failure. And yeah, it took 30 years, but agricultural productivity improved, child mortality dramatically improved, fertility rates went down because of our intervention or not. I guess it's always puzzled me that there's not a much more assertive and aggressive attempt by our Development Assistance Agency to propound that. And the downside of not doing that is there's very little constituency, as Judge Poe indicated, frankly, for foreign aid in America.
Well, thank you, Congressman. I agree with your basic premise that in fact, when Americans see the value and the results that are generated through these efforts, they suggest that we should be spending up to 10% of our public budget in this space. And as you know, we spend less than 1/10 of that. The reality is we know what works at this point, and we know what the priorities ought to be. We have focused in our humanitarian work on building resilience to avoid humanitarian requirements in the first place, and we know that that can be very successful. We focus our efforts on creating what I spoke about earlier, demographic dividends for countries, because that, by managing the rate of childbirth and birth spacing, and by supporting child survival to age 5 and ensuring kids get into school, we know that's the pathway out of poverty, and that generates more results and outcomes than other activities. We're refocusing on, and Ranking Member Berman mentioned in his opening statement,
my time is going to be limited, and I appreciate your response, but I'm not making that point. I want to see a more robust documentation so that the narrative, the story is out there that is a good story. And I think we're missing an opportunity, and have historically, and we're always on the defensive as a result. And I, for one, am kind of tired of it after 30 years. I'd like to see us, frankly, on the attack. Here's what we've accomplished. And it seems to me it would be nice to have an aid administrator who actually did that, instead of being here, not you, defensive, trying to, support an unpopular program. Well, it's unpopular because we don't tell the story of success. And if we've got successes, and I know we do, some of them very dramatic, let's tell it. Let's document it. Let's get it out there. And I strongly urge you to do so as part of your legacy. Coordination and structure. One of the things that has concerned me, and I think I told you this first time we met, is that for good or ill, the diffusion of aid programs, we got the Millennium Challenge, and we got an AIDS Africa initiative, and we got other things being coordinated by other agencies, and as a result, we don't really have quite the lead development agency we should have, in my opinion, where the focus is. And we bring to bear the deployment of resources in a very structured and coordinated way. As the aid administrator, of course, you're a loyal member of the administration, but can you share with us any of your reflections on how we might better structure ourselves to not only improve the lead role of AID, but more importantly, to make sure that the deployment of resources is an effective one?
Well, I appreciate that point as well, sir. I think that we have tried to do a number of things, such as our Partnerships for Growth effort, which helps to bring agencies together and ensures both coordination and USAID leadership to ensure that we're aligned in places where we're working together with, for example, MCC in Ghana and Tanzania and El Salvador, and that increasingly we're demanding policy reforms be made in the countries where we work so that we know that the gains we have will sustain and be more significant, and we'll get more value for how we invest our dollars. I will just reflect on the fact that coming to the U.S. government from a different type of institution, I'm struck by the amount of energy that that coordination requires. And I'm sure there are things that could be done in the future that would help make it a bit easier to do that. This is a very large and diffuse government, but it is led and populated in this administration, I think even in prior administrations, in this space by people who do really want to see those results. We all need to do a better job of communicating them, but we are committed to that outcome and would be happy to work with you on some ideas to make that coordination easier.
Thank you very much. Madam Chairman, my time is up.
Thank you so much. Mr. Royce.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Let me, if I could, Ambassador Shaw, go to the issue of the agreement that the United States had with North Korea on February 29th. The administration announced its plan to provide 240,000 tons in food aid, and it took North Korea about 2 weeks before it broke that leap day agreement. So I understand the food aid issue now might be in abeyance, but I wanted to ask you about that in light of the ballistic missile launch that they're preparing, and also reference the sort of growing skepticism that we have here in the House about the concept of food aid to North Korea, given our experiences in the past, the hearings that we've had in which we've had testimony about the diversion of that food aid. And I had a amendment prohibiting food aid to North Korea that passed the House last year. There were some changes made in the Senate so that the final provision said that you could not offer food aid if it was diverted for unauthorized use. And I think our problem is that that's sort of the North Koreans' specialty in this is diverting it for unauthorized use. So I would ask, is this something the administration is still considering with respect to food aid? And how would you ensure that the law would not be overstepped?
Thank you. You know, it is something we are considering. We have been in, as has been made public, a series of negotiations to ensure that credible controls are in place and that in any potential effort, the focus is on saving kids' lives and mitigating risks related to diversion. We saw in the past that when diversion took place, the program was shut down as a voluntary decision made by the United States and our agency. Going forward, the program we had been constructing was designed to get plumpy nut and other types of very specialized, high nutrition feeding products for very vulnerable kids. Those are not the types of things that are as amenable to diversion. That's why we were not including things like rice or other large-scale grain commodities, which are more vulnerable. Nevertheless, we are in an active discussion and would only go forward if certain conditions are in place with respect to our ability to ensure and protect against some of the risks you've identified.
If I were to go back to 2008 and some of the provisions that the then administration attempted to put into play, I remember the North Korean regime balked at the idea of having Korean-speaking inspectors on the ground. The French NGOs have testified here in the past that one of the reasons they balk at that is because there's real advantage to them being able to collect and sell whatever the product is on the food exchanges in Pyongyang for hard currency. And it is the ability to get their hands on that hard currency that gives us pause. I opened this session with my observations just about the quotes from a senior defector saying that it was pretty much the equivalent if we give them food aid because of their ability to convert it with giving them hard currency for their military program. And this seems to drive the attention of the North Koreans because this is where in the past we've heard testimony that they just lack the currency. In one case, we had a defector tell us they were trying to buy a piece of equipment they needed for their missile and on the black market. And this gyroscope, this Japanese-made gyroscope, was hard to come by and it was expensive. But they had to shut down the whole missile line until they could get the hard currency. They don't really have much that North Korea manufactures other than things done in a clandestine way, meth, different drugs that they sell illegally on the world market, missile parts. But this was part of the modus operandi to get their hands on hard currency. So again, I would just stress that this has been their past practice. They're very adept at it. And having broken this last agreement in the span of 14 days, I think we're beginning to see here that this new regime in North Korea is not different. The grandson's not too different from the father and not too different from the grandfather in terms of the way we're played.
Thank you, Mr. Royce. Mr. Sherman is recognized.
Thank you, Administrator Shaw. We're almost at the end. Take a breath. Almost everything of a broad nature that could be said has already been said, so I'm going to talk about a couple of very narrow topics, confident that my colleagues have not brought them up, namely the regions of Javik and Sindh. Before I do, let me express the obvious, and that is that the needs in the world for U.S. development will always exceed the resources available. And so the constraint is not a lack of good donor opportunities. The constraint is a lack of public support for foreign aid, which is the most controversial part of our budget. There is very substantial support in America for aid to Armenia, and I hope that in your suggestion that your budgetary requests will be greater in the future and will reflect congressional action. At least start with the congressional appropriations of the prior year and work your way up from there, as you do in most of the rest of your budget. Now, as to the Javik region of the Republic of Georgia, your request for Georgia's total is $68.7 million. The Georgian ambassador publicly stated that, and because this is something that we've had to review with the Georgian ambassador, and that is, should the United States target its aid at this particular region in southern Georgia? And would the Georgians take offense that you're going with one region instead of another? So I'm glad to bring to your attention the Embassy of Georgia stated that in support of our government's material commitment to the economic development for our citizens in the Samt-Ske-Javeti, I have no idea if I pronounced that correctly, region, and throughout our republic, looks forward to working with our friends in the U.S. Congress and the administration and with all American civil society stakeholders, including, of course, the Armenian American community, here's the key phrase, in encouraging the targeting of U.S. assistance to meet Samt-Ske-Javeti urgent need for job creation, infrastructure, technical, and humanitarian needs. Also, in the case of Georgia, you're dealing with a republic with many regions, with different ethnicities. Some have claimed that Russia has exploited these differences in Abkhazia and Ossetia. And here you have an opportunity to help this predominantly Armenian area of Georgia, not in defiance of Tbilisi, but rather the economic aid that will help make sure that this region is a source of stability and prosperity for the overall Republic of Georgia. And I hope that you will have a robust program in the Javik region. Second is the area of Sindh. You've requested $2.4 billion. Sindh is, as you know, in southern Pakistan, an area influenced by a moderate form of Islam and Sufism. This is an area that was particularly hit by the floods. I would hope that rather than just rely on Islamabad to set our priorities, that we would make the development and recovery of Sindh an important priority. Wonder if you could respond to that, or whether you'd prefer to just respond for the record.
I may briefly address those. We appreciate your points. On Georgia, and specifically the Samtskhe-Javakti region that you were referring to, we have been working with specific programs that work on agricultural modernization, social development, maternal health, and certain health and education infrastructure efforts, as well as support for civil society groups. We've increasingly tried to do that work in consultation with Armenian American communities, and with an eye towards launching specific public-private partnerships with those communities. So if there are partner entities that you are aware that have interest in that region, we would welcome being put in touch with them and would seek an opportunity to have that dialogue.
I'll make sure to put them in touch with you.
Thank you. And with respect to Sindh, I would just note overall the budget for Pakistan for USAID programmatic efforts is $900 and some million. So the 2.6 billion is I'm not exactly sure what that refers to, but and we have tried to focus the programs there. That's obviously a very complex working environment. We have nevertheless tried to focus on delivering concrete results. For example, in energy, we're now we've put 900 megawatts of energy on the grid as a result of our investments. In education, we're able to reach a number of kids and get them into educational opportunities that are more secular and broader. In the context of that particular region, our response to the floods and our efforts to distribute wheat seed in response to the floods really did help save the winter wheat harvest and improve the overall balance of payment situation for a country where that is critical to their own stability and therefore critical to our national security. So I appreciate your raising that. We constantly seek consultation in that program, but have tried to be results-oriented even in a very difficult environment.
I'll try to provide you with specific information there, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. The chair recognizes Mr. Fortenberry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Administrator Shaw, it's a pleasure to see you again. First, at the outset, let me say I do really deeply appreciate your professionalism and your dedication to innovation, as well as your heartfelt concern for the world's most vulnerable, which has truly marked your tenure at USAID. I also want to thank you for taking time to address the concerns about the prudential stewardship of U.S. foreign assistance dollars, particularly given the fiscal situation that continues to alarm many Americans, as well as, and it weighs heavily upon us here. I do frequently hear from constituents who express serious concerns about the disposition of their taxpayer dollars, particularly those going to foreign aid, even, and I emphasize this, even as they take rightful pride in knowing that the United States is the world's leading provider of meaningful humanitarian outreach. I'm also glad that you mentioned our colleague Don Payne, whose life and dedicated efforts on behalf of the poor we recently honored. Mr. Payne and I were co-chairs of the Malaria Caucus, and we'll continue to do so, but we were attempting to make further bipartisan progress on this important fight against malaria, which is a preventable disease but harms so many. I appreciate you raising this testimony in your written testimony. I appreciate you raising the issue. But I'd like you to address something that is of concern to me. Address the issue of effectively balancing our resources between the President's Malaria Initiative and other multilateral malaria prevention efforts. It seems to me that an outstanding review of the President's Malaria Initiative would support a relatively stronger weighting of this initiative relative to other multilateral activities that are less transparent or they effectively they're difficult to basically monitor for accountability and results. Let me give you an example. In your budget, there are substantial increases for population control initiatives in the Global Health Initiative, as well as substantial increases in the Global Fund, which the United States does not fully control. This suggests an ideological priority there that's inconsistent with our efforts to monitor cost while meeting basic humanitarian goals that we all agree upon. So I'd like you to address that concern, please.
Thank you, Congressman. Thank you for your specific leadership in this area and for helping us find opportunities, such as with the University of Nebraska, to essentially bring more excellence to areas of work like water and stewardship in that space. I also appreciate your mention of the Malaria Caucus, which has done very important work to establish support for this program. As you noted, it has been externally evaluated and shown to be incredibly effective. Those evaluations also discussed a more recent evaluation by Boston University, which looked at the processes of the PMI, also found that it was an effective venue for bringing the interagency together and coordinating U.S. government efforts, and it was effective at supporting partners like the Global Fund for AIDS, TB, and Malaria and the World Bank in helping them do their work more efficiently. So when commodities get stocked out, we were able to step in and solve supply chain issues a number of times in order to keep malaria control programs focused on results and effectiveness. It's really in that context of building a stronger partnership between PMI and the multilaterals, explicitly for the purpose of driving more of other people's resources to what we think of as prioritized areas where we can get results like malaria, that we have proposed the budget the way we've proposed it. And as you know, the Global Fund had to cancel round 11 of its funding, and that was intended to be the malaria round. In fact, countries had been encouraged to develop malaria plans. PMI had worked with countries to do that in a way that was coordinated with our own efforts, and we would have seen for every dollar we spent, $3 of other countries' resources going towards support for those plans. The same is true at the World Bank, where we've worked to create World Bank funding plans in countries where we work so we can get more partnership. If it were up to me, I'd love to see larger budgets across the board for things like malaria that we know save kids' lives. We made a number of very difficult trade-offs in order to present a budget that we think meets our fiscal constraints and prioritizes all of our potential efforts to get others on board with our task of ending child death from malaria, which is an achievable task.
Thank you. Let me insert this, though. But since we have prioritized raising funds for the Global Health Initiative as well as the Global Fund itself, that suggests that we are prioritizing population control initiatives, even though some of the increase in funding may be leveraged for PMI and other malaria control outcomes. Is that true?
The only thing I would take issue with is the Global Health Initiative overall actually experiences a small, very modest, but small aggregate decrease in funding. So it's not that, but there is a significant increase in order to meet our 4-year pledge that was made to the Global Fund. And we think it's a critical time to make that commitment and a critical time to keep the global consensus that has created an instrument that's brought in billions of other people's dollars to support global health. Global health is an area that without funding from other countries, the U.S. will end up taking a bigger and bigger share of global funding, and that won't be a pathway to sustainability or success. So we're very focused on crowding in other donors' efforts.
Our time is done, but I may need to write you further on what type of balance there is in terms of increasing population control measures versus other widely agreed upon humanitarian goals. We need to discuss that further.
Absolutely. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman for yielding back. Administrator Shaw, with a $10 trillion economy, we need to start treating China like a developed country. That means serious examination of the aid that we give to China. For instance, there is no reason, in my opinion, that we should be giving China money through USAID to become energy efficient and compete more aggressively and effectively against U.S. businesses to strip jobs from American workers here at home. The USAID budget states that it plans to expand efforts in innovation, science, and technology and evaluation with regards to climate change, which the significant increase in funding for the Global Climate Change Initiative indicates. Previous funds have been allocated to China to help develop its clean energy sector, carbon evaluations, technology innovation, and educational awareness. So specifically, within USAID's DA budget, how much will be directed towards programs in China especially in terms of clean energy and economic growth education programs?
Thank you, sir, for the question. The specific answer to your question is with respect to the FY13 budget request 0. The budget request is $6.5 million for China, and of that, the great majority is support for communities in Tibet and support for those Tibetan civil society groups and organizations. There's a small amount of support to continue a partnership between the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and their Chinese counterpart that originally grew out of the SARS epidemic and is now focused on a broader set of activities, including HIV/AIDS and ensuring that communicable disease threats doesn't spill out of China. But that's a small technical assistance effort, and the rest is focused on communities in Tibet.
So you're saying that none of the USAID's DA budget in the 2013 budget will go toward green energy, clean energy initiatives, and economic growth education programs?
Correct. That's right.
Okay. I'm glad that we got that cut off, because that was one that I was very concerned about. I see no further members here to ask questions. With that, Administrator Shaw, thank you very much for being before us today, for answering our questions. With that, this committee hearing will be adjourned.
Thank you.
Sorry about that.